Got a great pleasure to now introduce our next speaker. A very warm welcome to Gulammohammed Sheikh. Hello. Very nice to meet you. This is your microphone. Yeah, maybe both. Thank you. It's wonderful to meet you. It's been an unrealized project for me to meet you, because ever since we visited India, I was hoping we could do this interview, and I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask you how it all started. What was your epiphany? How did you come to art? How did art come to you?
I came from a sort of small town in Gujarat, from a middle class, lower middle class Muslim family. And soon after my schooling, I ended up in Baroda, which is an art school. Just by accident, somebody recommended it to me, and I went there. And it was literally a change of world. From simply the background of a small town, with all its constraints, simply being sort of from a middle class Muslim family, it was now in a kind of a community. And this small institution in Baroda was almost like a family. I think it was conceived like that, as a small institution, with a small number of students, and literally sort of 10 students a teacher. And the teachers were also new, they were all growing. So it was a process for us to grow along with them. So for students, we were wide-eyed. We did not know, and suddenly there came Michelangelo and Picasso and whatnot in front of us. So it was, if I were to put it in a direct form, it would be like in those days, it was eating, drinking, and sleeping in art. Plus, there was art to say, use it for its word. So in a way, it changed my world completely. Now the best thing that I gained or gathered from that institute was that it was not just art. It was not art alone. But they had combined, I gave it to Vidya and Kala, that it should be both artistry and art. And it was the first institution in the country to begin education at the university level. And I was there in its 5th year. And these were all young teachers, they were all in the process of experimenting, a new pedagogy, and we were all there, we were with them. So in a way we grew up with them, and I think my work completely.
And so that was the moment of the laboratory years of this Baroda school, and you said it was like a family. I was curious, in that mid-50s, at that moment, who were your kind of influences? I mean, you mentioned Picasso, but I was wondering if there was an influence also from pioneers and artists of previous generations in India. I've interviewed on my previous trips here Tayyip Mehta and interviewed Ahmed Hussain, so I was wondering what was the connection to those artists, and if you could talk a little bit about the relationship to the previous generation.
Well, my association with my old teacher was quite close. It was Benray, who was my immediate teacher, N.S. Benray. And in initial years, I would say that we all sort of emulated him. But I think when I was in the 5th year or so, I began to look at outside. I thought that I should look out of Baroda. And in a way, I went to Bombay. And I looked at a lot of art in Bombay, and I went to a place called Gulammohammed Memorial Institute, which was a small workshop. It was a building in which there were small studios where Hussain and Gaitonde and many others, they all worked there. And their friend Nasri was also there. So I think this is where I began my sort of career, and I began to take sort of quasi expressive mode, roughly inspired by the progressive artists. And in fact, my first exhibition 1971, when it took place in Bombay, I requested that for it.
Now I was curious also about, because we spoke with Vivan about the 1890 group, and you were a founding member of this seminal group, and there was this one exhibition, this collective exhibition, which Vivan told us about, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit from your perspective about this group. I mean, I'm very curious about this idea of what brought the group together, and also the link to the magazine, because you launched the magazine a little bit later, Rishik in 1969, and how that all connects.
Well, 1890 was the result of a comment that was taking place in India at that point of time. This was the second generation of farmers. And we began some kind of a dialogue at some point of time. I came to know Swaminathan, who lived in Delhi, and became friendly with him and had a dialogue with him. And then we got together about 12 artists from India, from different parts of India. And we thought that perhaps we would form a group. And we went to a place in Gujarat, where Bhavnagar, where there was a house. Actually, our host, the number of the house of our host was 1890. So it is where we sat. We were there for 3 or 4 days, and then we stopped and discussed. Just and all our whatever we could, and then we decided that we will adopt some kind of activity. It was written down there. So since it was done there, we thought we must give it a name. And that name given to became the name of the number of the house was adopted. Now, with regard to journals, I went to England in 1963 when the exhibition of 1890 took place. I was not present at the time when it opened. But I remember we went to meet Nehru. Swaminathan, who was far more political than me, he was in the Communist Party, he was in Dewan, etc. And he knew the person. So he went to meet Nehru. Remember, 4 or 5 of us were there. Broken man. Then he said, why have you come to me? Swaminathan, never mind. He said, sir, we have not come to meet you as a politician. We have come to meet you as a writer. He was delighted. He was absolutely delighted. When he considered me a writer, yes, sir, you have written this story of India. This is how it happened. And he said, yes, I will come. And I said, and then we met Octavio Paz. The great Mexican poet was here. In fact, it was at Vivan. I was saying, I had gone for an interview for Commonwealth Scholarship, and I was staying with them, and Vivan thought about election commissioner. And we had come to know that Octavio had already landed in Delhi. And Vivan's mother found it out that he was living in the house. And we went there. Vivan, Navina, Vivan's sister, and I all landed there.
Octavio was delighted because he had not met any artist until then. He was only meeting diplomats and all that. So he said, I am so glad that you folks have come to meet me, and I want to meet all your friends. And eventually he became a friend of 1890. And he wrote the catalogue of 1890. So he actually offered himself and became a great friend of Swaminathan, and even wrote a poem on him, which is in Piedra d'Este. Well, that is the story. So when I went to England for 3 years and returned, I had seen in England a number of small magazines, and I was quite sort of keen on. I had already published in Gujarati earlier before I left for England, and Swaminathan had begun a journal called Contra, which was a kind of a journal, which was a small magazine, about 8, 10, 12 pages, and it was more about raising issues. So, and that folded up after 3 numbers. So we were sitting in Baroda, and then we thought, okay, can we also not start something? And there were all these 4 or 5 people sitting there, all had their what you call Rashi. Their what's Rashi in English? Rashi was Vrishchik. It was Scorpio. They were all Scorpio. So that is how we thought that, since we are also going to raise issues, this is going to be a journal of communication. We are going to have dialogue with artists of India. So we started printing 500. We sent it free of charge to a whole lot of people, but we made our own list, and that actually ran a campaign also to change the sort of structure of the National Academy, etc., etc.
It raises obviously also the issue of the bridge between art and literature, which is a big concern for me in Europe, that has existed throughout the avant-gardes of the 20th century, and the neo-avant-gardes was a very present thing, and in the last 10-20 years it has more and more disappeared. The literature world and the art world are kind of apart, and I think it's a big necessity to bring that together again. So I was very curious, because you are also a literary figure, and there is your own writing, and that ties in with the magazine. Can you tell us about your practice as a writer?
Well,
is it a daily practice?
I wrote poetry basically, I Gujarati, and occasionally wrote on art, but this mainly poetry in Gujarati, and published a lot in those in the late 50s and 60s, and sort of experimented with various kinds of forms like free verse, etc., etc. in Gujarati. And then my mentor, my literary mentor, called Suresh Joshi, who was a great writer, a short story writer, also critic, etc. He began a number of journals, and there were something like 5 or 6 journals that he edited, one after the other, one folded up and the second started, things like that. Now for all these he wanted me to do something on art. So we did cover pages in the beginning, we actually printed lino cuts on top of it, because there's 500 copies and you could literally print a lino in a press, and we managed to do that. These were sort of literally an original print which went to every reader. That continued for a long time. So literally there began a sort of a movement. Even today in Gujarati journals you would find that there is always a section on art, and artists and writers in some ways sort of continue to interact. And you might have heard other day Atul Dodia, or I think Ranjit Hoskote mentioned about Atul's work, Atul Dodia, who had taken Gujarati poetry and made paintings from them. So there is that kind of a connection which exists in Gujarati literature.
Now I wanted to ask you about teaching, because you mentioned the school in Baroda as a student, but I've been told again and again, coming to India and researching here, how influential you are as a teacher. And we discussed with Nivedita Menon this idea of teaching, and teaching also being an activity of imagination. Can you tell us about this?
Well, one didn't realize at that point of time what one was doing. It was just a job that came to you, but at the same time, it was something so exciting. I was passionate about it, because that came to me as if, because firstly, as Mrs. Yarawala was saying, that it was money, because I had no money, I just lived on, sort of, I was a penniless student. So when I got a job, it was very exciting, and I said that, well, now I will get a regular payment every month. But at the same time, teaching came to me, and I said, what? And there was one subject, and I still remember and cherish it. It was called Story of Art. So you had to tell the story of art to very young students, fresh, young students coming from different parts of the country. Sometimes, they came from a village, sometimes they were tribal students, sometimes, Vivan came from Doon school, so there were all kinds of students. And you spoke in English, you spoke in Hindi, you even spoke in Gujarati at times. I spoke, sometimes I took 3 classes of the same. And I remember that literally it was a process of learning. It was a process of learning about art. And I learned so much from my students. I would say that these are the ones who taught me or shaped me what I am. They asked questions. Those were the questions, which made me think of so many things. And I think in a way, when I returned from England, again when I asked, the job was still available, and I landed in art history again, despite the fact that I was not trained as an art historian. So my art history in that sense was slightly different. It was not hardcore art history, we did not see, as they would say that, it is usually the provenance and the date, etc., etc. But what interested me as a painter was to look into art, look hard into art, to discover what that work of art is, perhaps what that work of art is about. One can find out about its social backdrop, etc., but that work itself carried something within it, and there the difference between the historical and the non-historical disappeared, and one could move from one into the other.
And we should talk more about your painting, because you mentioned your painting and you moved from abstract work to narrative work, and there has been many years of narrative painting, and you in the last years have then gone more also into the digital. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about these transformations and how over the year your painting changed.
Well, I mentioned that earlier, in the late 50s and 60s, I sort of was drawn by the expressionist idiom and did a lot of painting, in fact, of horses. But my horses were not like unfettered, horses, but they were sort of horses of the Tonga. That is, those we were, with the horse carriage, a horse of a carriage. And that perhaps had something to do with the small town that I lived in. But then it was a period of gestation during 3 years in England, when I hardly painted. I just painted to get out of that institute. And then on return, it was a big discovery journey. I traveled a lot, and actually I have wanderlust. And I had also traveled a lot in Europe, and especially Italy. And there suddenly I found that there were sort of meeting points between pre-Renaissance and some aspects of historical Indian painting. I mean, I don't distinguish between the historical and the other, but just to describe it, I say that there are certain kinds of painting that I began to see that there are overlaps. And then I also began to see that the kind of naturalism, that has been planted, in the Indian art schools was slightly unreal. And I began to look for alternatives, and these alternatives were visible, in some of these sort of like the Sienese painting, like I would say, some Rajasthani painting, or such schools or such paintings. I began to look at, and I said that can one do something with it? Is it still there? Would it be too exotic? Would it mean that we are just doing something which is already done? Actually, there was no question of redoing it. It was a question of imbibing it. If there was something, if there was an element which was still alive, and if it is possible to integrate, and then that is how began a kind of an experiment. And I did a painting for Returning Home, and that was a painting in which I made a collage. I used a photograph of my mother, I used a part of a Mughal painting, I used part of something from the European painting, put them all together.
Like a composite?
Like a composite.
Yeah.
And at that time it looked as if sort of, what is it? This is some kind of a khichdi, something like, a kind of a mixture, can you do that? But that's exactly what I felt at that point of time, and that is how I began my journey. Now the digital has come in a slightly different way. Actually what has happened, it is not digital, it's something else. I began to make books. I began to make means I wanted to paint books. So I made a book which was a accordion format, concertina format. So it was a continuous painting, painting after painting after painting, which you could keep on painting. I painted for almost 10 years. And then I also began to do something called shrines. Shrines, I'm using that word deliberately because I wanted to have some kind of a religious connotation, but I did not want to make religious shrines. So wanted to change the meaning of it, and so I made boxes. So in a way, boxes were also opened and closed. It's like sort of having a kind of a sanctum and then you close it. So in a way, book and the box, these are the two things which combine, and alongside came the digital. So I made a series of digital. What digital work happened like this. I happened to be in London in the British Museum bookshop, and I found that there was a small postcard which was of world map. It was called Epstoffe Mappa Mundi. This was a 13th century European map, and I began to read about it, and I found that this was a circular map, I found that this was made in parchment. It was found in Italy, and then last seen was in a church in Hamburg, where it was destroyed in Allied bombing. So the reason for me to make world maps, I decided that I will use the same map. I used that map, we tried to digitize, we made as big as possible an image, and then I began to paint over it. So it is actually not entirely digital, it is part digital, part painting.
And you've realized so many things. I was wondering, within your work, what are your unbuilt roads? What are unrealized projects? Projects which have been too big to be realized, too small to be realized?
Far too many.
Dreams. Can you tell us one? One you regret?
Well, I have already done one project, which I have been long thinking about, was to build a city, the whole city. And last year an opportunity came to me, and so I decided I'll do it. So I made 6 large panels, 6 by 4, that means 24 feet wide, and then it comes to 12 feet down, that means 20 by 24 feet, and it is not only just painting, but also it is papier-mâché, and that also adds to it sculpture. So images which are 3-dimensional, the figures are added to that, and I may do more,
so
many more.
This could be the next next project. Now I wanted to ask you also about museums, and there is an incredible energy here in terms of the market. There is an absence to a certain degree, and as many artists mentioned, to a big extent, of public museums, public institutions. Hence this idea of actually inventing institutions, and I'm very curious how artists imagine their kind of ideal museum or art center to be. What would be your ideal museum or art center, public institution for India in the 21st century?
Primarily, I have some problem with the idea of museum. Let me make it clear. But if one were to have museum, it should be an open museum. It should be completely open. It should not have doors. It should be something you could walk into. You should be able to interact with things. It should not be something which is in closed door and which sort of touch me not kind of a thing. It should be something where you would actually be able to touch it. Like that in Indian sculpture, go to places, almost every sculpture is touched by people. Even the holiest of holy are touched by them, because there is something about it which is so much part of us that we want to relate ourselves to it. We do not want to remain away from it, and I do not know whether we could realize it, but I think if we were to do something, we should do something where it becomes available to everybody. And secondly, it doesn't only remain available to few of us, those who live in English language, but those who also are in many other languages of India. We have this fantastic language culture, and we have large tracts of this country, which also in a way is like a museum. You go to some villages in Rajasthan, you will see how people have painted their houses, it's like that. And I think somewhere, if one were to think of a utopian thing, then it is that which one would. If it flows from your life, something that you would not only interact, but also you might even create. You will be part of making, part of creating it.
And such an institution is obviously always a negotiation, I suppose, between the past, the present, and the future. Panofsky, the great art historian, once said that if we invent the future, we always invent it, or very often invent it, out of fragments from the past. And you have incorporated a lot of fragments from the past in your work.
For instance, I have said once that, you see, we live in multiple time. It is, you walk down the street and you have people, who lived 200 years ago, who live in a time which is 500 years ago, who live in a time which is 1000 years ago. So we have actually access to multiple times. Now, if that access is available in life, then our history is also accessible to us. And now we can access the way we like, so if we wish to. So what I would like to do is to draw from all possible sources, not necessarily the sources which are surrounding me, but also I want to discover sources. I want to see what there is, what there was, and perhaps build a kind of a more holistic kind of a world. And that's how sort of I have been drawn towards either Sienese painting or to Mughal painting or to Rajasthani painting.
Now I have a last question, and somehow in a text of yours I read that living in India means living simultaneously in several cultures and times. Often one walks into medieval situations, runs into different zones. Now, and this is the last question. This leads us. This leads us to the rugs question, really, because I suppose that if you think about this, simultaneity of many different Indias, that you probably also won't believe in this idea of sort of one rising power, but more in a sort of a polyphony. But I still was curious about this idea of India as a rising power, and there is a peculiar combination of innocence and arrogance, says Rux, that can threaten our sanity. And what are the resources that we can use to maintain a critical sense so that the footprint of this rising power is not disastrous? And obviously we can connect it also to Amar Kanwar's question. What is upsetting you about the great Indian story?
Well, I would say the same thing what Nivedita said just a while ago, that I don't know whether there is a great Indian story. Yeah. But at the same time, I would say that there are many things that would upset you. But at the same time, what I would like to say is this, that despite the fact that there are many factors, which stand as great obstacles, against all kinds of ideas that you have, there is still hope. And I think the hope lies in art somewhere, if at all there is hope. I think the only area in the world that is left today is art. I think we have lost hope in many areas of life. Most areas leave us sort of in a kind of not that art doesn't leave us in an area of anxiety, but that anxiety is both positive and negative. Now that anxiety and that art, I think something, if it will keep us alive, if it will keep us going somewhere in some direction, if we return to art.
It's wonderful. It's very much what Gerhard Richter says, art is the highest form of hope. And I do have a very last question. Your advice to a young artist. We cannot not finish this interview without a Rainer Maria Rilke question. What in 2011 is your advice to a young artist?
No, I don't have any advice to young artists.
Thank you so much, Gulammohammed Sheikh. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.